So, great. Without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. So, as many people know, we have been working in close collaboration with the Centre for Irish Studies with Irish Programs in Boston College for a number of years. It's a kind of key partnership for us here in Queen's. And as part of that, we have an annual exchange. So we have a member of faculty or an advanced postgraduate student from Boston College who joins us for a week every year, and we send one of our staff or postgraduates over to BC. Today's Irish Studies seminar is part of that exchange programme. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Rob Savage, who is Professor of History at Boston College and also the Interim Director of Irish Programmes at BC. Rob's an old friend of Queen's, so I'm inviting you back after a few years since your last visit, Rob. It's always great to have you over here. It's a pleasure to see you in person. So Rob teaches courses in modern Irish, British and Atlantic world history and courses in media, film and propaganda at BC. He's been a visiting fellow at the Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute at Trinity College Dublin, visiting research professor here in Queen's in the School of HAP, a Leverhulme visiting professor at the University of Edinburgh, and a visiting professor at the National University of Ireland in Galway. His many publications in modern Irish history include Irish Television, the Political and Social Origins in 1996, A Loss of Innocence, Television and Irish Society, 1960 to 72 in 2010, Sean Lemass, a biography in 2014, the BBC's Irish Troubles, Television Conflict and Northern Ireland in 2015. And I'm very happy to say his new monograph, which will be published this week by Oxford University Press, is Northern Ireland, the BBC and Censorship in Thatcher's Britain, 1979 to 1992. So it's a great pleasure to invite Rob to come and speak to us on that subject this afternoon. So I will just put up Rob's slides. There we are.
Great, thanks, Peter. Nice to be back here in Belfast. I've been visiting Queen's for over 20 years, I think. I came here first on an exchange that Alvin Jackson had helped set up many years ago. I'll say a few things about the book that I've just finished. Peter asked me if I'd talk about the book, and what I thought I'd do is speak a little bit about sort of issue of censorship, but not the sort of self-censorship that the book is really about. What I thought I'd do is really speak about 1988, the year that official censorship was imposed by the Thatcher government. I want to, first of all, place the introduction of censorship in context and explain why 1988 was a particularly difficult year here in Northern Ireland. And then I'd like to address how the issue of censorship of the BBC was seen from abroad, from outside of the United Kingdom and outside of Ireland. And lastly, I'd like to explore how the World Service was affected by the introduction of censorship of the broadcast media here in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. So during the Troubles, a relentless war of words unfolded in the media as different sides sought to shape, if not control, the narrative's conflict. In these circumstances, a propaganda war became acute in broadcast media, especially in television, a medium that was and maybe still is the most important source of news and information. Before the outbreak of violence, BBC programming about Northern Ireland was heavily influenced by the powerful unionist establishment here in Belfast. From the early days of radio in the 1920s through the 1960s, broadcasting officials in both Belfast and London embraced a type of self-censorship when issues, subjects, or news concerning Northern Ireland was at stake. This meant that the region's programming, or programming from London about the region, avoided any mention of discrimination, gerrymandering, or the grievances of the Catholic minority. Programming that focused on Gaelic culture or that suggested Northern Ireland was in any way Irish was actively discouraged. But this began to change after the explosion of violence that traumatized both Derry and Belfast in the summer of 1969. Throughout the 1970s, as violence escalated, the broadcast media, increasingly less deferential to Belfast and London, developed cutting-edge news and current affairs programming that inevitably questioned and criticized the policies of both administrations. Such criticism infuriated unionists at Stormont, as well as Westminster's Labour and Conservative governments. Determined to promote a narrative justifying their policies and upset with a pronounced lack of deference to the authorities, successive British governments bullied the broadcast media, threatening to punish broadcasters for programming it objected to by either withholding funds or introducing explicit censorship. When the Tories came to power in 1979, broadcasters were warned by the Attorney General, Michael Havers, that the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act would be deployed to prosecute correspondents in contact with members of outlawed organizations, especially the IRA. Such constant pressure by the British government encouraged a remarkable degree of self-censorship within the BBC. Executives were acutely aware that formal censorship was not an idle threat, but a real possibility. Nevertheless, both the BBC and independent television companies continued to produce remarkable news and current affairs programming that addressed the complex nature of the conflict here in Northern Ireland. Many of these programs were critical of the government and the security services, ensuring that the relationship between the Thatcher government and the broadcast media would be difficult and tense. 1988 proved to be a remarkably violent year, underscored by a particularly grisly series of events. First, set off by the Army's killing of 3 unarmed IRA members at Gibraltar in March of that year. The killings in Gibraltar were, of course, followed by more violence in Belfast. First, at Milltown Cemetery, when a loyalist gunman shot and killed 3 mourners attending the funeral of the 3 IRA volunteers or members killed at Gibraltar. A short time later, 2 British corporals were killed in Andersonstown by the IRA. The television captured a number of these events. Of course, the rampage of Michael Stone at Milltown Cemetery and the capture of the 2 corporals in Andersonstown. A short time after this carnage had made its way into living rooms around the globe, the IRA set up a bomb aboard a minibus in Lisbon, killing 6 soldiers who had taken part in a charity fund run to raise money for a local YMCA. Then in August, the IRA exploded a massive roadside bomb in Tyrone, killing 8 young soldiers, 6 of whom were still in their teens, and wounding 28. The soldiers were returning from leave in Britain when the blast occurred as they traveled late at night on a dark road through rural Tyrone. Howard Thornton, the duty inspector at the Omagh RUC station, described the scene he encountered when he arrived with a young constable to help. Quote, "It was in the middle of the countryside, no street lighting after midnight. My whole memory of the scene was absolute carnage. It was like driving into hell." News coverage of the horrific bombing was extensive. Although 8 soldiers were killed that day, the Irish News later reported that 5 of the young soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome later committed suicide. After the attack, a deeply frustrated Margaret Thatcher lashed out at the RUC Chief Constable, Sir John Herman, in a furious row about who was to blame for the security lapses that enabled the attack. The Chief Constable recounted an angry Prime Minister threatening to pull troops out of Northern Ireland, saying she would no longer be willing to, quote, "send her boys over in waves to be killed." Herman later complained to senior Irish diplomats that he was upset by Thatcher's, quote, panic reaction, and resented what he defined as the neo-colonial connotation of that remark and its World War I overtone, regarding it as, quote, amounting to distancing herself and her government from Northern Ireland. In an interview conducted by the BBC a short time after the Tyrone bombing, Gerry Adams defended the attack, claiming it was the result of the British Army's presence in Ireland. All of this bloodshed provided the backdrop to plans by Channel 4's innovative late-night talk show After Dark to invite Adams to appear as a guest to address the conflict. When news of the planned program leaked in September, a number of Conservative MPs denounced Channel 4 for providing a platform for terrorists. Amid a growing controversy, the network abandoned the program, drawing criticism from advocates of free speech who argued it was guilty of self-censorship. Liz Foreman, the director of programs at Channel 4, denied this was the case, arguing that plans had been at a very early stage and were abandoned when a suitable opponent could not be identified to debate Adams. Under intense pressure, the IBA, that is the Independent Broadcasting Authority, announced that if Channel 4 had not canceled Adams' appearance, it would have stepped in and banned the program under Section 4 of the Broadcasting Act. That autumn, Adams did make an appearance on another program after the IRA tried and failed to kill Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, the most senior civil servant in Northern Ireland. Bloomfield and his family narrowly escaped death after a series of bombs exploded at his home, collapsing its roof. In the aftermath of the attack, Adams was interviewed on the BBC Northern Ireland program Talk Back. He noted that although he was not a spokesman for the IRA, the organization had notified the public that the attack should serve as a warning for those who worked for the British. The Thatcher government argued that this was proof that the IRA was using the broadcast media to intimidate innocent members of the public. The increased activity of Republican paramilitaries created fear that the IRA was embarking on a new campaign that might make its way to mainland Britain. By the fall of 1988, graphic television reports of bombings, shootings, and rioting, along with stories critical of the security services, increasingly upset many in the Thatcher government. These stories also exacerbated a public that was fed up with the conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. The unrelenting violence provoked Margaret Thatcher to embark upon an aggressive security initiative designed to strike back against the violence of the IRA. In this context, Britain's broadcast media was an easy target for a government fed up and embarrassed by sustained unrest that had dragged on for 20 long years. In October of 1988, the Thatcher government announced a series of security initiatives, including the introduction of state censorship of the broadcast media. Although the broadcasting ban stipulated that any group that supported violence would be banned from the airwaves, it specifically targeted Sinn Féin. Before the Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, announced the broadcasting ban in Parliament, Marmaduke Hussey, who had been appointed chairman of the BBC Board of Governors by the Thatcher government, was summoned to the Home Office. When told the government was introducing what were defined as restrictions, Hussey noted that the BBC would be unhappy, warning there would be, quote, strong criticism from some quarters. He told Hurd, according to minutes of the meeting, privately, he could see some attractions in proceeding in this way, not least in that the broadcasters had now been given a clear statement by the government about what could and what could not be done. In a telling, if not somewhat absurd statement, he told Hurd that he welcomed the fact that the direction would not ban the actual reporting of events. Marmaduke Hussey, who was known as Dookie to his friend, and the Director General Michael Checklin issued a joint statement the day after Hurd's announcement, protesting the government's restrictions, complaining, quote, this new instruction, which includes for the first time banning of interviews with elected representatives, sets a damaging precedent that will make our reporting of Northern Ireland affairs incomplete. The statement was a very cautious one. It lacked any real sense of urgency and did not use the word censorship or mention freedom of the press or free speech. When the most senior managers and editors of the BBC met with the Deputy Director General, John Burt, a short time later, they complained bitterly about the tepid reaction of the chairman and the Director General. Many were alarmed by the Thatcher government's intervention and furious at the response of both Hussey and Checklin, believing that there had been an appalling failure in leadership. Senior staff complained that the two men were too quick to accept restrictions that would inhibit their work and too willing to engage in discussions concerning how the BBC would comply with the order. Minutes of the fractious Board of Management meeting revealed considerable animus and a marked sense of disillusionment among the BBC's top editors. Many were especially angry at the Director General, because he had not resolutely stood up to the Thatcher government and defended the difficult work the corporation had done during 20 years of appalling violence. They were convinced that the BBC had been cowed and behaved with timidity and inexcusable weakness. Jenny Abransky, editor News and Current Affairs Radio, spoke for many when she complained that the statement issued by the chairman and the Director General was a devastating blow to the integrity of the corporation. She and her colleagues had hoped for a clear, unambiguous response, stating that the leaders of the BBC fiercely opposed political interference. Robin Walsh, the veteran editor from Northern Ireland, was the most forceful in denouncing the failure of the BBC to vigorously defend the freedom of the press and challenge the government's imposition of censorship. He complained, quote, "The overall effect of the statement from the BBC in comparison with the strong words from David Nichols of ITN had been devastating in the television newsroom. Someone from the BBC should have stood up to defend the BBC's first-class record in the minefield of Northern Ireland coverage." Walsh was referring to independent television news editor David Nichols. Press reports described Nichols as passionately defending the integrity of his staff and arguing that ITN had never given a platform to advocates of violence. Nichols had robustly backed the editors, reporters, and camera crews at ITN who had provided comprehensive coverage of events in Northern Ireland for close to 20 years, stating, "We have seldom put a foot wrong." No such statement was issued by the BBC. Walsh told the Deputy Director General that many regretted that ITN had shown more of a backbone than the BBC. His criticism of what he regarded as a half-hearted response of his superiors underscored the frustration of many within the corporation. Walsh enjoyed a reputation as a courageous editor who understood the complexities of Northern Ireland and the politics of broadcasting news and information about the Troubles. As news editor here in Belfast, through much of the 1970s, he oversaw and protected journalists who had addressed seminal events that defined the conflict. His opinion was highly respected among his peers in both London as well as in Belfast. World Service editor David Spall was especially upset, believing that the Thatcher initiative was especially humiliating for his division of the BBC. He expressed dismay that the Director General's acceptance of the restrictions were inadequate. Again, he stated that there were, quote, "feelings of regret in Bush House, the home of the World Service, where a fuller response would have been welcomed." He complained that the BBC was, quote, "rushing to toe the line in accepting censorship." By 1988, the World Service had gained a well-deserved reputation for excellence. It was broadcasting in 40 languages to an audience that was estimated to be over 120 million, who regarded it as a critical source of unbiased news and current affairs programming. The World Service had its origins in the Empire Broadcasting Service, established to cater to Britain's former colonies by John, later Lord Reith, in 1932. The World Service had later set up BBC monitoring during the Second World War. BBC monitoring proved a valuable government resource that listened to and transcribed foreign news, especially reports and propaganda from Nazi Germany. During the Cold War, BBC monitoring expanded and continued to listen to and report on foreign broadcasts from the Soviet bloc. It did this from its base in Caversham, just outside of Reading. In the aftermath of the Thatcher government's imposition of censorship, BBC monitoring paid particular attention to the reaction to the order provoked from the international print and broadcast media. Maybe we can just move forward on a couple of these slides and I can speak to them. This project came out of my last book, the BBC's Irish Troubles, a book that was launched here by Dom Bryan a number of years ago. It was published in 2015. When I was working on this book, I looked at how the BBC was set up here in Northern Ireland and looked at its evolution up to the 1980s. But I ran out of material from the BBC. I was trying to get material from the 1980s, but a lot of it hadn't been vetted yet and wasn't available. And just as I was finishing the book and had sent it off to the publisher, the BBC wrote to me and said, "We have all of the material you've been looking for from the 1980s." So at that point, I made my way over to Caversham, where BBC Monitoring used to be, that houses the written archives of the BBC. And I found that there was just a tremendous amount of really interesting material. And that's why I came back to write this book that comes out Thursday. It's bouncing there. Anyway, so the book, there it is. So that's the book that's coming out Thursday. So what I've been able to do is look at material that's just been released from the 1980s. Anyway, back to the World Service. Maybe we could go forward again. Margaret Thatcher here, of course, visiting Northern Ireland. You can't see, but she's wearing big wellies after coming off the helicopter. And the next slide is Broadcasting House, the home of the World Service in London. There's another slide that just shows the Empire Service, which was again set up in 1932. So as the Empire is sort of receding, the Empire Service and then the World Service is expanding. The next slide shows Princess Elizabeth and Margaret making a broadcast to children of the Empire during the war. And we can go to John Tusa and leave it there. Thank you. Here we are, okay. During the Cold War, again, BBC Monitoring expanded and continued to listen to and report on foreign broadcasts from the Soviet bloc from its base in Caversham, just outside of Reading. And again, in the aftermath of the imposition of censorship, BBC Monitoring began to report on how the imposition of censorship was being seen outside of the United Kingdom. The imposition of censorship was announced just as John Tusa was beginning a tour of Africa. But before I get to him, I want to talk about John Burt, who again was at this meeting that Robin Walsh and others were complaining about. He was taken aback by the hostility that he encountered and was forced to acknowledge the anger and disappointment expressed by senior members of the Board of Management. Although he promised to convey his criticism to both Hussey and Chucklin, he was defensive and ended the meeting by arguing that the BBC had no alternative but to comply with the government orders. By coincidence, censorship was announced in Parliament just as John Tusa, seen here, managing director of the World Service, was touring East Africa, visiting both Uganda and Zimbabwe. In Kampala, the Ugandan government reacted to the ban by accusing its former colonial ruler of blatant hypocrisy. The Ugandan government-aligned National Radio Service was sympathetic to the fact that London was preventing subversives who were, quote, supporters of the IRA from having access to the airwaves. However, it reported that the Deputy Minister for Information and Broadcasting, Mwambai Makwana, accused the BBC of employing a double standard. The minister told Tusa that the Ugandan government was upset that London permitted Ugandan rebels to have access to the BBC World Service, while at the same time it banned Irish ones. Makwana complained of a double standard, arguing that the World Service was, quote, giving a platform to subversive Ugandans living in exile in Britain, from which they tell lies about the situation in Uganda. Tusa responded by defending the integrity of the BBC, maintaining that it was, quote, independent of government and in its editorial policy, and that its primary responsibility is to give news and views objectively, accurately, and truthfully, without fear or favor. But the Ugandan minister saw an opening he could exploit, retorting, quote, the British government is doing through legislation what the Ugandan government is requesting the BBC World Service to do through mutual understanding. For the Ugandan government, the issue was simple. If the British government would not allow Irish subversives access to the airwaves, they should stop giving what they considered Ugandan subversives airtime on the World Service. Makwana told Tusa to take a simple message back to the BBC in London, quote, stopped giving a platform to subversive Ugandan elements residing within Britain, for which they are misrepresenting the situation in their home country. Tusa next visited Zimbabwe, where he hosted a reception to mark the opening of a new relay station in the Seychelles, a station that would enable the World Service to increase its audience throughout East Africa. The Harare visit was also meant to celebrate the BBC as an impartial voice of reason in a region troubled by political instability. However, Tusa was forced into an awkward position when asked about the broadcasting restrictions. Although he, quote, denied the BBC was an instrument of British propaganda, he accepted that the broadcasting ban was counterproductive and would only help the government's opponents, admitting, quote, you very seldom gain anything by preventing freedom of speech. Back at Caversham, again, just outside of Reading, Christopher Bell, Deputy Managing Director of the World Service, reported to the Director General and senior staff that Caversham had been closely monitoring international reaction to what he termed was the IRA ban. Like many of his colleagues, Bell regarded the initial statement from the Director General and the Chair of the Board of Governors as inadequate. Under intense pressure to respond to widespread international criticism of the ban and accused of hypocrisy, Bell believed that the World Service was floundering and unable to respond to legitimate criticism. Although he requested help in dealing with an embarrassing crisis that challenged the veracity of the World Service, no support was forthcoming from his superiors. He complained, quote, I've tried to get agreement from senior BBC figures to be interviewed on the implications of the ban, but the original decision of a brief statement by the Director General and Chairman still stands. No follow-up interviews are allowed at the moment. Output here needs such interviews and needs them badly. The World Service found itself exposed to withering criticism that it was complicit in the introduction of censorship by the Thatcher government. Bell was upset, convinced the World Service had been abandoned to its critics and unable to fully defend itself from disparagement and outright ridicule. To underscore his frustration, Bell continued to review international reaction to the ban, sending his reports to his superiors in London. He highlighted the work of Radio Havana that broadcast into Latin America and the United States. It argued that the British government's introduction of censorship, along with policies that weakened a suspect's rights to remain silent, were due to increased, quote, rebel activity in Northern Ireland. Radio Havana's international audience was told increased, quote, repressive measures against separatist organizations in Ulster came after harsh media censorship was imposed, banning radio and television interviews with members of the IRA and Sinn Féin. Cuban radio reported that an authoritarian Thatcher government had given increased power to the courts and the police in an effort to crush heroic rebels fighting for freedom. Havana reported that Thatcher's opponents had denounced the new regulations as ridiculous and repressive, predicting they would fail. Radio Havana concluded, quote, it suffices to say that since the 12th century, when the Anglo-Normans took over the richest regions, the struggle of the people of Northern Ireland for the freedom never ceased. Cuban radio condemned British policy in Northern Ireland where, quote, a second phase of the Irish struggle resulted in Britain sending thousands of troops to quell violence, maintaining the ban, quote, reveals London's intention of solving the conflict through violence. Radio Havana rejected the accusation that the IRA were criminals or terrorists, insisting the conflict is, quote, a struggle for national liberation and for the unification of Ireland. Now the news media from all over the world report a gloomy, ominous outlook in Ulster. The increase of repressive British measures can only have the same effect as a lighted match to a powder keg. In South Africa, the Johannesburg Newspaper, The Citizen, responded to the broadcasting ban from a different perspective, one of sympathy. The newspaper was the voice of the National Party, which developed, promoted, and institutionalized the notorious policy of apartheid. South Africa already had imposed restrictions on the print and broadcast media, but was considering tightening controls on broadcasting. The Citizen's editorial maintained that because the IRA had stepped up its campaign of bombing, it was understandable that the Thatcher government would react with strong countermeasures. The newspaper reported that President Botha had threatened to impose similar restrictions if, quote, South Africa media does not practice self-discipline to smother propaganda put out by those people who promote violence. Botha used the British restrictions to justify his government's imposition of censorship and warned that additional restrictions would be imposed, maintaining, quote, the South African press should exercise self-discipline and smother the views of people advocating violence. If they do not, they mustn't complain when we adopt measures similar to those used by the British government in the fight against terrorism. The voice of the white minority government equated Sinn Féin with the African National Congress and declared that, like the BBC and its banning of Sinn Féin, the South African Broadcasting Corporation was also a semi-state body that would not, quote, give the ANC and its fronts any chance whatsoever to put across propaganda. He maintained, what the British ban does show is that the South African government is not alone in imposing restrictions that may be displeasing to opposition parliamentarians and civil rights leaders, but which are considered necessary in the battle against terrorism and internal strife. Britain will find it difficult to condemn South Africa media restrictions after its own ban on TV and radio interviews with the IRA and other organizations. The Voice of South Africa, the international radio service of the Republic of South Africa, was operated by the South African Broadcasting Corporation during the apartheid era. Although its audience was mostly African, it mirrored the BBC World Service as it broadcast in multiple languages and was focused on reaching listeners beyond its borders. It reflected the political, cultural, and social views of the white minority government, broadcasting from Johannesburg from 1966 until the demise of apartheid in 1972. The Voice of South Africa offered its observation on the broadcasting bans soon after the restrictions were announced in London. The station acknowledged Margaret Thatcher had been much criticized for imposing censorship, but was sympathetic, telling its audience that, quote, given the worsening security situation in Northern Ireland, including the attack on soldiers in County Tyrone, the Prime Minister had been calling for terrorists to be starved of the oxygen of publicity. The Voice of South Africa supported the Thatcher government, arguing that 3 years earlier, it too was forced to introduce restrictions on the media, exclaiming, quote, terrorism coverage, conveying the impression that South Africa was on the verge of revolution, although patently false, was polarizing the country and poisoning international relations. Long before that, a comprehensive ban had been put in place on publicity for members of the ANC, a body dedicated to achieving its political aims through violence. Sympathy from a brutally repressive South African regime may have unsettled advocates of a free press, but it was ignored by the Thatcher government. Other African nations took note of the British crackdown on the broadcast media. The Kenyan Times, described by the World Service as the party paper of the Kenyan government, also commented on the broadcasting restrictions in editorials that addressed its frustration with the BBC coverage of African events. One editorial echoed the complaint that had been made to John Tusa by Ugandan Deputy Minister for Information and Broadcasting, Mumbe Makwana, earlier that year. The Kenyan Times complained that the World Service often interviewed Kenyan dissidents who have run away from their country of their own volition and are seeking to destabilize the government friendly to London. It argued that in Africa, radio was the most influential source of news and information, while acknowledging nearly all radio stations on the continent were owned and controlled by the state. The editorial reflected the government's concern that the Western press too often focused on problems besetting young emerging nations, arguing, quote, in its eyes, the only African news worth printing concerns coups, scandals, and tragedies, stories which depict an Africa being unable to manage its own affairs in a civilized manner. In criticizing the BBC, the party paper of the Kenyan government maintained that the country's leaders had long taken issue with the World Service, quote, painting a dark image of a former British colony, making every effort to take its rightful place in the Comity of Nations. When Kenyan officials complained to the British government, they were repeatedly told that they had no control over the BBC because the BBC was independent. The editorial responded to this, stating, in keeping with Kenya's declared foreign policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. Nairobi has for many years accepted that answer. This is why we find the decision of the Conservative government of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher to curb the BBC from giving radio interviews to Irish groups so puzzling. The Kenyan Times maintained that the British Prime Minister had intervened to deny terrorists a platform in order to protect the state from its enemies. The British Prime Minister was encouraged to do the same in an African context, to stop the BBC from giving Kenya's enemies a platform to spew damaging propaganda. Quote, "We remind number 10 Downing Street, this is exactly what the government has been demanding from the BBC. Mrs. Thatcher has that power. Let her use it." In India, the nation's largest news agency, Press Trust of India, chastised the BBC for a selfish double standard, complaining that it had regularly interviewed Sikh extremists, although it was now censoring Irish ones. It demanded that the British Prime Minister intervene to prevent Sikh militants from having access to the British broadcast media. It's reported, carried by over 500 newspapers at the time, indicated that in the aftermath of the broadcasting ban, the government had contacted London and stressed that, quote, if congenial political and economic relations were to be forged, it was imperative that the Thatcher government curb the activities of Sikh extremists. Nations that were overtly hostile to the United Kingdom took particular delight in accusing the British government of hypocrisy and promoting a double standard. In Syria, Damascus Television, considered a mouthpiece of the government, explained the restrictions were part of a broader effort to crush Irish revolutionaries who were intent on freeing their country from the shackles of British colonialism. The Syrian television service reported that the decision to introduce a harsh regime of censorship was due to British fear of growing support for, quote, Irish revolutionaries who demand their country's liberty from British imperialists and wanted to reunite their country as one state. The same was true in other parts of the Middle East. In Tehran, the Iranian agency also saw duplicity, incredulously noting that the BBC had promised that it would continue to provide balanced reporting about Northern Ireland in spite of the restrictions. The broadcasting ban was imposed in the waning days of the Cold War, as Mikhail Gorbachev was implementing the policies of glasnost and perestroika. These reforms helped to stabilize and ultimately collapse the Soviet Union while undermining authoritarian regimes throughout the Eastern Bloc. Reaction to the ban behind the disintegrating Iron Curtain caused consternation for the BBC and the World Service in particular. In Czechoslovakia, the media was slow to embrace the changes that were sweeping across Eastern Europe. The first uncensored news was not broadcast from Prague until November of 1989. Nevertheless, it too was quick to lambaste the Thatcher government's introduction of censorship. Czechoslovakia television was regarded as the voice of the communist government and a source of propaganda for an authoritarian regime. It reacted to the introduction of the broadcasting ban by pointing out that Western politicians frequently singled out socialist countries, including Czechoslovakia, for criticism, accusing them of denying citizens basic human rights, including the freedom of the press. Quote, their statement said, quote, however, the darkest place is underneath the candlestick, as the proverb has it. And so it is that the British government today banned radio and television from broadcasting any interviews with Northern Irish organizations, which it has designated as extremist and terrorist, including the Catholic Sinn Féin Party, which is legal as a member of parliament and dozens of local councillors. The government has, in practice, banned the elected representatives of the people from giving interviews. Czechoslovakia television concluded that British democracy had been upended, as the state had always allowed legal organizations, quote, the right to express their views. Radio Moscow's English service also enjoyed denouncing what it defined as the arrogance of the Thatcher government. The celebrated commentator Boris Belitsky highlighted the damage done to the reputation of the image of Britain on the world stage. Radio Moscow's correspondent quoted Sarah Spencer, General Secretary of the British Council for Liberties, saying, quote, "Violence cannot be defeated by injustice," and pointed out that the ban was denounced by journalists working for the BBC, maintaining that the, quote, "measure places Britain alongside South Africa and Chile in restricting media freedom." Bolitsky noted the irony of the news that week by contrasting Margaret Thatcher's imposition of censorship and a variety of other repressive initiatives with the enlightened penal reform of Mikhail Gorbachev. He told his audience, "You will agree with me, I'm sure, that there's a striking contrast between the British government's highly repressive measures in Northern Ireland and the humane approach of the Soviet government in easing the plight of those whom the law is obliged to penalize." Polish media also commented, acutely pointing out that the imposition of censorship had created tensions within the BBC between upper levels of management and the staff of Britain's public service broadcaster. The Warsaw First program reported that broadcasting executives had embraced the repressive legislation and even put in place additional restrictions that were harsher than the government's original order. According to Polish press reports, this contrasted with what it described as widespread protest from journalists who objected to the banning of legal political parties from the airwaves. It reported journalists, quote, "believe that shutting the mouths of people representing so many political organizations will make it impossible to present the truth about Northern Ireland." They claim they will only be able to present one side of events. Although embarrassed and frustrated by the criticism emerging from the Caribbean, the Middle East, the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union, and former colonies in Africa and South Asia, the World Service and the BBC in particular were even more alarmed at how the restrictions were viewed amongst allied nations. Le Monde defined the Thatcher government as, quote, "transforming the glory of the BBC into a servile state puppet." And reaction was not dissimilar in the United States. One of the most devastating articles addressing the initiative was written by Jonathan Power, a highly respected foreign affairs correspondent who had worked for the BBC in the past. His syndicated article appeared in over 40 newspapers throughout North America. The piece was a scathing critique of British censorship. Writing 2 months after the restrictions were introduced, Power claimed that the British Prime Minister had, quote, "got away with this amazing feat of censorship without much more than an odd newspaper editorial being ranged against her." He reported that immediately after the restrictions were announced, a one-day strike was planned, but this had been avoided as union leaders had argued against it, believing that since the BBC management opposed the restrictions, there was nobody to strike against. His article argued, quote, "there were grumbles below deck, but no fire in the belly of the ship, and the heat was soon gone before it had chance to properly ignite." The domestic service, both radio and television, neither was a match struck in protest. Power was particularly astonished that there had not been a more robust protest at the imposition of government censorship in one of the world's leading democracies. He told his readers that the policy was especially devastating for the World Service, where, quote, "the credibility of the BBC had suffered heavy damage. No longer do many of its listeners around the world treat it with their habitual high regard for being the voice of quiet reason, fair reporting, detached inquiry, and the pursuit of truth." Power sensed a degree of apathy in British society when it came to censorship in Northern Ireland, but noted that this interest was not shared in many parts of the world. According to Power, the Conservative government's intervention in broadcasting was simply the latest in a long campaign to undermine the independence of the BBC. He reminded readers of a much publicized May 1982 interview in which Margaret Thatcher had, quote, "called for the World Service to launch a massive propaganda campaign of the kind we have never mounted to influence opinion in the Soviet Union." This statement had prompted the then director of the World Service, Gerard Mansell, to reject the Prime Minister's proposal, arguing to convert what we now do into propaganda would be utterly counterproductive because our stock in trade was the truth. Power argued that the ban was part of Thatcher's war of attrition against the BBC, arguing it should be viewed as part of an 8-year assault on a free and independent broadcast media. The New York Times remains arguably the most credible, influential, and respected newspaper in the United States. It criticized the broadcasting ban when it was first announced in October of 1988, and a month later published a series of blistering editorials and articles, much to the consternation of the Thatcher government and broadcasters throughout the United Kingdom. It criticized both state intervention in the broadcast media and the Thatcher government's revision of the rights of those accused of offenses related to the Northern Ireland conflict. One editorial, titled "Mrs. Thatcher's Muzzle," argued that the Prime Minister's decision to censor the media and restrict the right of prisoners was a mistake, stating, quote, "She is spectacularly wrong with a new limit on journalistic freedom and her proposal to allow a criminal's defendant's silence to weigh as evidence against him." These initiatives were defined as counterproductive because they would enable Sinn Féin to, quote, "mischiefully pose as defenders of liberty in denouncing censorship." The influential American paper argued, quote, "Britain's good name as mother of parliaments and seedbed of political freedom is an asset more precious than the crown jewels. How bizarre for it to be tarnished by a conservative government." But it was not only BBC monitoring in Caversham that was following the international reaction to the broadcasting ban. The British Information Service in New York sent detailed reports to the Foreign Office in London, chronicling the reaction to the ban in the United States. It painstakingly explained that it was not only the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe that were publishing derisive editorials and stories about the Thatcher government's initiative. The BIS reported that the broadcast ban provoked widespread criticism from both liberal and conservative newspapers across the United States. Hostile editorials that appeared in a variety of publications, including Newsday, the Long Island Daily, the Salt Lake Tribune, the Arizona Republic, and the Oakland Tribune, were collected and sent to London. Again, the Foreign Office was told that there was a clear consensus that emerged in the United States across the political spectrum. All saw the imposition of censorship as wrong. All agreed that it violated or eroded civil liberties and undermined the freedom of the press. The Foreign Office understood the damage being done to the international image of Britain, but the Thatcher government remained unimpressed. There was no groundswell of the opposition to censorship from the British public, and therefore there was no political pressure to lift the ban. For 6 long years, the BBC and the World Service and the independent broadcasting companies were left to twist in the wind, continually exposed to accusations of hypocrisy or criticized as the propaganda voice of a repressive Tory government. Whatever one thinks of the politics of Sinn Féin, especially in the 1980s, the party enjoyed considerable electoral support in spite of its embrace of the IRA's ruthless violence. Formal censorship of the broadcast media lasted until 1994, when in the midst of the peace process, John Major's government recognized the policy was not only embarrassing, but was simply unsustainable. In many respects, the attempt to deny Republicans the oxygen of publicity was an admission of failure by a deeply frustrated Thatcher government. The imposition of censorship highlighted the inability to accept or appreciate the depth of hostility that challenged the government's legitimacy in the eyes of many citizens of Northern Ireland. Threatening, bullying, denouncing, and finally censoring the broadcast media did not enable London to control the contested narrative of the Troubles. Thatcher's successors learned that the voices her government silenced were in fact critical in trying to resolve a long, bitter, and deadly conflict. The British government's suppression of free speech may have silenced Sinn Féin, but it also succeeded in damaging the United Kingdom's reputation as a champion of democracy in a troubled world. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much. I'll take a seat here and we'll open it up for
just show you a couple of these images here. This next image is Caversham. This is apparently a estate that had at one point been owned by the royal family, and it was the sort of headquarters for BBC monitoring, and it was also the place where the written archive is housed. The next slide actually shows the World Service. It's sort of an old photograph of the World Service in the post-war period, and I think that last image is of the written archive, which is just adjacent to the palace where the BBC was listing was situated.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Rob. It's a fascinating paper, an important subject. So what we're going to do is, just bear with me for a second. Get rid of this. Open it up for questions. So let me just move the camera over here. So you are on camera. There we are. Great. Excellent. So we have questions from the room and also from people online. I've got a question online to begin with. Rini Elliott. Rini, do you want to go ahead? Unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes, I've just been researching 1972, the Troubles era, and a little bit about the media in relation to that. And my understanding is that the censorship in the Republic of Ireland began a lot earlier, around about 1973. And I'm wondering what their response to the BBC's censorship was, and also, you know, whether why it sort of got left out of your narrative, if you like, in terms of various different people's responses.
Sure, it's just a matter of timing. You're right. Censorship had been put in place in the Republic long before it was put in place in the United Kingdom, and the Thatcher government looked to Ireland and wanted to emulate what the Irish had done. So there was admiration for the regime of censorship that had been put in place in Dublin by the Thatcher government. You know, the sort of when Heard made the announcement in Parliament in October 1988, talking points were circulated throughout the cabinet and to MPs that made the point that this was a legitimate initiative, that it had to be done, and pointed to the success of censorship in the Irish Republic. So, you know, the British were well aware of censorship. Margaret Thatcher had initially said that she would never support censorship, but she changed her mind by 1988. And again, I was trying to sort of give an idea of just the kind of level of violence that was taking place in that year, and the great, you know, the frustration that that she experienced. But in Dublin, I think there was understanding of what was going on in London, although not in RTE. You know, RTE was opposed to censorship, and the Director General was opposed to it as well. But it's so there's an understanding by the Irish government, sympathy for what was going on. But you know, again, in many respects, censorship, the British broadcasting ban was modeled on what was going on in Dublin. I mean, one thing that the British could not do was ban Sinn Féin from the airwaves during an election. So during an election campaign, Sinn Féin would all of a sudden have access to both radio and television. But once the polls closed, once the vote was ended, they were back off the air.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Okay, I see we've got a question from Peter McLaughlin. Peter, go ahead.
Hi, Rob. Sorry I couldn't come along today, but enjoyed your talk. Look forward to reading the book. I was kind of pick up where you kind of seem to be concluding there, Rob, about the major government, and wondering if you had any comments on what role the Adams visa played in this, because it seemed like even before, I suppose it made political sense then for the major government once there was the ceasefire, I guess, because it must have been after the ceasefire, I'm guessing, that they changed the legislation. But my understanding is even all the focus with the Adams visa is on the political controversy and what it meant for the special relationship and the British media going crazy. But there seemed like there was a really interesting debate in the US media. And of course, Adams, on that occasion, does he even go on the Letterman show or something like that? And even the New York Times, like you mentioned, I think there was even a pretty crucial editorial that even before Clinton makes the decision. So it seems like there's a really, which must have shocked the British embassy. There was a really crucial debate in America around the Adams visa, which must have been a bit of a wake-up call as well for its closest ally, and the idea that they're so common and freedom of speech. That must have had a big influence, did it?
It did. It did. In fact, the British government was appalled that the Clinton administration provided that visa. John Major was epileptic. I mean, he wouldn't take a call from Bill Clinton, if I remember correctly. Adams was treated as a rock star in New York. He went on the Larry King Live show, which was a tremendously popular program that had all sorts of, bring all sorts of guests, celebrities and others on. And he was featured with Ken McGuinness. And McGuinness and Adams sit down at a table. Larry King is opposite them. And McGuinness wouldn't shake Adams' hand. Adams was able to portray himself as a victim of censorship, right? As a victim of political oppression. And King made much of the fact that the conversation they were having could not be broadcast in the United Kingdom. And a week later, Adams was interviewed on the BBC. I can't remember the name of the show, but because subtitling had to be done, or the dubbing of voices, the interview was just awkward and surreal. And at that point, Douglas Hurd, who had introduced censorship, came out against it. He argued that if the peace process was going to move forward, if any progress was going to be made, this had to be done away with. I mean, in that interview that was, I'm not sure if it was on the BBC or one of the independent stations, Adams was able to run circles around his interviewer because of the awkwardness of the fact that he couldn't be heard. That I think they were dubbing in his voice at the time.
Thank you, Rob. Cheers.
Okay, Sean.
I'm just wondering, during this crucial period in the 80s, I mean, how much reporting has been done from Northern Ireland by agencies from outside Northern Ireland? I mean, my understanding is that the hunger strikes are a turning point there, that reporters who had previously sat in London and got handouts from the British government actually went to places like Tyrone and saw what was happening.
Right.
And did that continue? In other words, the question is, when the Thatcher government is trying to slam a lid on what British agencies are reporting, how much reporting is taking place by agencies from outside the UK?
The occasional story, but it's a good question because it isn't until events such as the Gibraltar and the Michael Stone rampage at the cemetery and what happens in Andersonstown that garners international attention, and the broadcast media, the print media, comes to Northern Ireland again. So it's almost as if when there's a crisis, when there's a spectacular sort of bloody event, that gains the attention of the international media. And the media come and oftentimes they stay for a little while, not for all that long, but they sort of report on the event, the atrocity where there was a bombing or whatever. But they also look to other stories. They look to Catholic alienation, or why is the IRA still functioning and why hasn't it been defeated? And many of those programs are critical of British policy, and that annoys the Thatcher government. But it's that 1988 is a particularly gruesome year. I think many of us might remember the images of those episodes, right? And it's not just the rampage of Stone at the cemetery, or the sort of the two corporals who were seized, in Andersonstown, but it's the coverage of the shootings at Gibraltar. There's a program done by Thames Television called Death on the Rock, and it's followed by a BBC Spotlight program done here by the local BBC station that infuriates the British government because it challenges the narrative that they've presented, that the shootings were justified.
Good, thank you. Adrian, let's go to you next. I can't hear you, Adrian. You're muted.
I'm unmuted now. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going back to the period. You may have already covered this in a way, but my impression was that the media ban was introduced by the Thatcher government when it was under huge pressure to introduce selective internment. So curiously, from the Thatcher government's point of view, they did this so as not to have to introduce selective internment. In other words, it was seen as doing something lesser, but they felt that under the pressure of the events and the various atrocities and attacks that were happening, that something had to be done. And this was the something that they did. But actually, they were resisting pressure for selective internment. That was the bigger issue at the time.
That's right. That's right. You know, Tom King was the secretary at the time in Northern Ireland, and he was under a huge amount of pressure. You know, Thatcher had told him that he had to do something, that she wanted something concrete. And you know, the broadcasting ban was one initiative. There were other initiatives. The suspension of remission for prisoners incarcerated, Republican and other prisoners incarcerated was one thing. I think the notion that a suspect's decision to remain silent could be also held against them. That was another initiative. But yes, there was pressure to introduce internment once again. But I think many understood that would be hugely problematic and could just be tremendously counterproductive.
Sure. Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Yeah.
Robert, happened to see last night on television the rebroadcast of a program about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan on the World Service, I think, and he argued that Thatcher's personality had a big impact in kind of changing some aspects of U.S. policy. So we know that hostility from Tory number 10 towards the BBC isn't confined to Margaret Thatcher, but do you think that what was the impact of her particular personality and her kind of hostility towards IRA? Without her, does something like this look possible?
Yeah, I think so. And she thought that was true, whether it was during the Falklands War, during the miners' strike in Scotland. So she regarded the BBC as untrustworthy, as always critical of her policies, and had tried to put in place people such as Marmaduke Hussey, right, as the chairman of the board, right, people that would be more sympathetic to her sort of conservative philosophy and her attitudes towards the media. But yeah, she didn't pull punches in criticizing the BBC, and did it openly in Parliament and in interviews. When she was first elected Prime Minister, she it was traditional that the BBC would interview the new Prime Minister. She refused to be interviewed by the BBC and was interviewed by one of the independent television companies in London as a way to sort of get a dig at the BBC. But yes, she had a very strong personality. You're certainly right there.
Fergal?
Hi, Rob. That's great. Thanks. Are you aware of any kind of security or intelligence kind of voices pushing for censorship or subsequent to censorship? I mean, is there any kind of assessment of what the impact of censorship has actually been in terms of Sinn Féin's support, particularly its electoral support? Because obviously you're into kind of counterfactual territory in assessing that.
Yeah, well, David Miller has written about this, and Danny Morrison has spoken about it. I addressed it in this last book I did on the BBC's Irish Troubles. Sinn Féin's presence on television just dropped dramatically, right? Journalists found that it was just very difficult to go out and interview a member of Sinn Féin when the interview had to be either subtitled or you had to call in an actor to mime the words of Jerry Adams or Martin McGuinness. So I mean, the Republicans were pushed off of television and off of radio, but it really didn't affect their electoral support. In fact, I think their support would increase, marginally, but their support would increase. So it really didn't succeed in diminishing the electoral support that Sinn Féin had. But it was frustrating for Sinn Féin, and Danny Morrison and others would would make this clear, that it was impossible for them to get their message out, except during campaigns, which was really odd, right? That during a election campaign, Sinn Féin would have access to both the both radio and television.
And just in terms of the security and intelligence responses, because in the period I'm familiar with, collaboration period, they just noticed spent quite a lot of time complaining about the propaganda, the impact of Republican propaganda, as they say. They make quite a lot of efforts, not terribly successful ones, even from fake news and so on.
Yeah.
So I mean, presumably they're also in your period very concerned.
They are.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. In the throughout the 70s, the Northern Ireland office, people in the Northern Ireland office are pushing for censorship, not just of the broadcast media, but of the print media as well. So they're tremendously frustrated with the success of Sinn Féin in getting access to the media, and furious with somebody like Gerry Adams coming on television after an atrocity, after a bombing, and blaming the bombing on the British presence in Ireland, like he did after the bomb went off in Tyrone that killed the young soldiers, so the security, many in the security services were advocates of censorship, but as the 70s into the 80s, others in the Northern Ireland office believed that censorship would not be sustainable, and it was sort of put on the back burner throughout the 1980s. And Margaret Thatcher herself would say on a number of occasions that we don't do censorship in Britain. It's not something we're going to do. She argued that it was the responsibility of the broadcasters to censor themselves, right?
Okay, thanks, Fergal. Any other questions? Yeah, Eamon.
One of the things I'm conscious of, I'm just juggling various dates in my head here. It's around the same time that, well, I mean, one of the things that Thatcher does with broadcasting, for instance, which is a bit of kind of previous government protocol, is that she moves from the idea of public information films sponsored by the government to actual advertising of government policy. And one of the ways in which that comes through in Northern Ireland then is the advertising, what starts as the advertising of the confidential telephone line, which turns into this series of increasingly elaborate, narrativized, almost mini films. And I wonder if you looked at those in relationship. I did a bit of work on this some years ago with a colleague. We never were able to get information from the advertising agency or the NIO. When you asked the NIO, they said, go to the advertising agency. If you asked the advertising agency, well, the NIO has all that information. So we were never able to get any kind of information on that. I wondered if you had any sense of how that fitted in, that not just that you're going to block off one set of voices, you're also going to promote your own.
Yeah, it was something that was resisted by the BBC. So UTV, when these ads first came out, and initially they were ads about a confidential line. If you see something reported, call this number. But they became more elaborate, where you had actors sort of in dark corners being approached by shady characters and all the rest. The BBC was appalled with the notion that they would have to broadcast these. UTV decided that they would do it, but they argued that, well, we're a commercial television service, we'll charge a fee. So UTV was able to run these as advertisements. The BBC resisted, and I think it was just after Enniskillen especially, and I think it was Tom King, who was the secretary of the time, he made it clear that he expected the BBC to begin running these ads, and the BBC did. And there was tremendous disquiet about this happening. And then the sort of announcer that was initially doing the voice for calling the confidential line, his life was threatened, and so the BBC suspended these ads, but they were forced to bring them back again. But it was tremendously contentious within the BBC. Sure, yeah.
Can I ask a question, Rob? I mean, thinking about the Republican movement itself, I mean, obviously in terms of PR, publicity, propaganda, if you like, the United States is the crucial market
Right.
to touch. But is there any evidence of the Republican movement responding to any of these kind of positive, attitudes towards it that you've been talking about in the Eastern Bloc countries, even in left-wing media in within the European community at the time? Is there a strategy? Is there an international strategy looking beyond the United States?
It's a very good question. I imagine there would be. I mean, I haven't found evidence, and I haven't really looked for that to see how the Republican movement was reaching out to try and engage aggressively, proactively with media. I mean, they certainly were responding during the hunger strikes, especially to foreign correspondents and trying to engage with these correspondents. But I'm not sure if there was any really sort of proactive effort to reach out to Czechoslovakia, to Cuba, or Nicaragua. But it's a very good question. I'm not sure that happened. I mean, Sinn Féin complained about the ban, but journalists made the point that the ban made it difficult for them to challenge Sinn Féin about Republican atrocities, about Republican mistakes, right? That Sinn Féin could, argue, well, we can't speak. We're not going to, but they just sort of ignore the media and use the broadcasting ban to sort of deflect criticism of some of these sort of catastrophic incidents.
Thank you, Rob. Do I have any other questions from the room or from people online? Margaret?
Do you think, Rob, that issues like the row about, it was independent television, wasn't it? The Murder on the Rock.
Yeah.
And the Ashton Orty and banning people throughout the whole period. Did that feed into the BBC thing?
It does. It makes it more difficult for the BBC. I mean, Death on the Rock is done by Thames, one of the independent companies, and it challenges the sort of the British government's position, and that adds pressure onto the BBC and onto broadcasters. It infuriates the Thatcher government.
The press go mad on it, don't they?
They do. I mean, especially the tabloid press, the right-wing press, argues that the BBC has blood on its hands, that it's supporting terrorism. The more mainstream papers are more skeptical. The Guardian and other papers, more left-leaning papers, applaud a program like Death on the Rock. Think that it's important that kind of independent investigative journalism be promoted and protected. But yes, it certainly infuriates the Thatcher government, who, they intervened to try and stop that program from being broadcast and failed. And they intervened to try and stop a similar program that BBC Spotlight was doing here in Northern Ireland. And the Spotlight program, what the government was able to do was to convince the BBC that it should only be broadcast within Northern Ireland and not on the national network. So the Spotlight program that follows Death on the Rock is seen in Northern Ireland, but not in Great Britain.
Oh, okay.
Rita, you have another question?
Oh yeah, sorry, I couldn't resist asking you another question. I went to live in New York in 1988, and I was really shocked to hear all these interviews with H-Block prisoners being published on public broadcasting service radio in New York. And, the interviewers and the commentators seemed very familiar with them all and knew their names. And, I'd been living in the Republic of Ireland up to that point, had never heard of any of them. So I'm just wondering whether, if you took that as an example of a place that wasn't censored, would these people have had more support had they not been censored in the Republic of Ireland and in the UK? Or is that a $50 million question?
It is. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you're right. I remember, Kieran Nugent, for instance, made his way to the US. He made his way to the US illegally. He got into Canada, snuck across the border, and it ended up being interviewed on the McNeil-Lehrer Report, which is, a prestigious show on PBS news broadcast. And he was interviewed in the New York Times and on radio until the British Embassy actually tipped off the immigration service that he was in the country illegally and saw that he was arrested. So yeah, these people had access to the media in the United States, and some of them could give a good interview and make their case in a way that they couldn't hear in either in the Irish Republic or in Northern Ireland after 1988. But the point is that the members of the IRA hadn't been interviewed. Republican militants hadn't been on television since 1979. Right? I mean, when Thatcher first became prime minister, a member of the INLA was interviewed wearing a disguise, and this created a tremendous backlash because it was just a short time after Ari Neve had been assassinated, and so the appearance of an actual IRA paramilitary or Republican paramilitary was extremely rare, but the programs were incessantly critical of British policy, and that's what really infuriated the not just the Thatcher government, but the Labour governments before hers.
Good. So, if you want to follow up on anything that Rob has said this afternoon, or any other aspect of the media war about Northern Ireland in the 80s and early 90s, we direct you to the new book out on Thursday.
That's right.
Those of you who are still in the room, there it is up on the screen there. Northern Ireland, the BBC and Censorship in Thatcher's Britain, published by Oxford University Press.
Right.
And available in all good bookshops and online as well. So I think it remains for me to thank on your behalf, Rob, for coming and speaking to us this afternoon. We might give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Syndicate, I appreciate it.